Hello, everyone. Before we begin today, I just want to thank you guys for all your hard work thus far. We're about halfway through the semester, give or take a little bit, and I know this is a lot of work to do. We're doing a 15-week course in 6 weeks, so I appreciate all the work thus far. Today, we're going to be looking at The Country of the Blind by H.G. Wells. So we're going to look at some background of H.G. Wells, not listed on our agenda, but we're going to look at some themes from his work. We're going to look at some of his, along with his background, some of our literary theories, and finally dissect the text, do a close reading of The Country of the Blind. So, a little background: he was born in 1866 in Bromley, England, and his family was lower middle class. Right, so immediately you want to think of biographical criticism through the lens of Marxism and psychoanalysis. Right, this idea that he was from the lower middle class, and so it had to have shaped his thinking in some way. We want to view his life and his work with that in mind. His dad, Joseph, bought a small china shop that never made much money. He sold cricket bats, gloves, balls, and played professionally to make ends meet. Cricket is extremely popular, so that's in England, so that's a good job. But they just barely made ends meet. His mom Sarah went to work as a maid or domestic servant when his dad broke his leg and wasn't able to work. So again, we want to think of same with our previous story, the idea that for a man of this era, being supported by a woman definitely is going to impact him psychologically from the shame type of culture that would produce. Also, being a maid or a domestic servant makes one extremely conscious of class differences especially in England, that's much more class stratified officially than the U.S. We are too, but we like to, in the U.S. we like to often ignore that or pretend like it doesn't exist. In England, it's ever present. In 1883, he won a scholarship to the Normal School of Science in London. He worked with T.H. Huxley, an extremely famous biologist, but he ended up failing geology and lost his scholarship in the spring of 1887. I like to include that little detail because it shows that no matter what's happened at any point in your life, there's always time for a comeback. I know I've experienced them myself. I've hit some very low points, didn't think I would ever climb out of. And so I always hold on to those parts of biographies. His mother wanted him to be a merchant to the upper classes, to try to rise above his class. Wells worked unsuccessfully at a number of jobs: draper's assistant, chemist's assistant, and teacher's assistant. I think you can see a pattern there. It's part of the job structure there too, that you work with someone who has an expertise in order to try to learn that trade. He settled in as a teacher for about a decade, and then he decided to give up teaching and move in with his aunt and uncle and try to write for a living. So again, very conscious of class structure and how it influenced him here. But he takes a big risk and says, I'm going to try my hand at writing and make this very risky venture. He is very successful. The Time Machine was an instant success that propelled him to fame. Highly recommend I don't know if it's just because I grew up with it or what, but the old version of the movie from the movie poster there, I just, to this day, I could watch all the time. I think I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. And he eventually becomes known as the father of modern science fiction. That's not to say that there was never anything resembling science fiction before him. It's more, he really started defining the genre, popularizing it, and he was just a genius in that regard. The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, just a few of his most famous works. And when you go see movies now, a lot of them follow the patterns from those films, right? So they might be a different, or from those books. They might be a different version or a play on it or reversing it. But really, he really established this genre that 130 years later, we're still using endlessly in our popular culture. Science fiction is a genre of speculative fiction, typically dealing with imaginative concepts such as futuristic science and technology, space travel, time travel, parallel universes, and extraterrestrial life. Okay, so anything that is science related or technology related and extends into fiction. His book War of the Worlds, that brought him into fame, was adapted into a story for broadcast radio. It was aired on Halloween night, 1938, and read by Orson Welles. It caused general panic because audiences thought the descriptions of aliens attacking New Jersey represented actual news. Okay, so what the radio station decided to broadcast it was a fake newscast, right? And now it's really hard to get all these details exactly right, because over the last decade or so, they've uncovered that some of this is a mixture of myth and reality of how much of this is true. But a lot of it's true. And a lot of it was created into a myth afterwards. So the radio show begins with a fake news broadcast about an attack on New Jersey. At first, you don't know it's aliens, but eventually, you're just hearing news broadcasts and they're going to reporters and there's some kind of attack. And eventually it turns out, that much later on, you find out that it's an alien invasion. Well, in the beginning of the broadcast, they put on a note that said, hey, this is fiction. This isn't real, right? But what happens is not everybody tunes in for the beginning. And this was actually compounded that night because the most popular radio show at that time extended a few extra minutes, right? So it went beyond its normal end time. And so a lot of people watched that most popular show and then switched over to what ended up being War of the Worlds and never heard that warning in the beginning. So people panicked. Again, it's very hard to unpack the myth surrounding what really happened, but there were reports of widespread panic and different results from that. In the days following the adaptation, there was widespread outrage in the media and by public figures. The episode secured Welles' fame as a dramatist. It was readapted numerous times, including, I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, and the showing in Buffalo in 1967 had many phone calls to the police and other isolated incidents, and it seems like every 10 years or so you hear about this happening again, that some radio station somewhere did it and there was some kind of fear or panic. It also started a brand of fiction that became very popular that mixed reality and fiction and tried to fool the reader into believing it was nonfiction, right? An example of this, more recent, I'm not sure if you guys would still know this movie, but the Blair Witch Project. When that first came out in the early 2000s, it was kind of an indie release, independent release, and the vast majority of people who originally went to see the film did not know it plays like a documentary, so they assumed it was a documentary. And it's not until the very last scene of the film, really, where it becomes obvious that it's not, right? But and even then, if you have somebody who, is willing to suspend disbelief, many people could watch the whole movie and think it was real. And so these type of things have happened much more regularly since Wells did War of the Worlds. His science fiction and a lot of science fiction accurately foretold a number of important scientific and social achievements decades, sometimes even centuries before they actually come about. Things like chemical warfare was not something they thought of at his time, and yet he created in his fiction, and now it's a reality. Same thing with computer chips, some advances in women's rights, splitting the atom and atom bombs. Those are just a few of the things that were predicted in his science fiction and ultimately came to pass. I think I mentioned this in an earlier reading. What science fiction's really known for is pushing boundaries in ways that might not be acceptable in nonfiction or in a culture in general, or even in some forms of fiction. But in science fiction, you can say, well, this isn't a real world. This is just, imaginary about the future. And so you can get away with pushing some boundaries. So gay relationships, interracial relationships were part of science fiction for, probably at least a half a century before they became more regular parts of our culture. Now, in order to understand H.G. Wells's work, you have to understand his perspective and understand that his writing, perhaps more than other writers will look at this semester, was meant to be didactic in many ways. Didactic means it was meant to teach, to educate, to, in his case, almost propaganda-like, to promote his ideas, right? And some of his works do this very effectively. Some of his works, less so. They come off as very heavy-handed. So in order to go into his work with a good understanding, there's some ideologies he believed in that perhaps we should look into just briefly. Through reading books like Thomas More's Utopia and Plato's The Republic, which is where Allegory of the Cave is, he decided he wanted to reform society. He became a widely respected and well-known supporter of socialism and pacifism. Okay, so I'm going to talk about socialism, what that is, but pacifism is opposition to violence. And there's all different levels of pacifism. For instance, there's some pacifists who believe that killing animals for food breaks with pacifism and you should be against. Many pacifists don't believe that as well, or many other different aspects about pacifism. I will say I actually am a pacifist, and for my personal beliefs, these are just my personal beliefs, is that all violence is a failure of an intelligent, creative solution, and that all violence could have been prevented. But that's, again, just my personal viewpoint. Socialism is a social and economic system characterized by social ownership and control of the means of production and cooperative management of the economy, as well as a political theory and movement that aims at the establishment of such a system. Okay, so what's all that mean? Social ownership and control of the means of production. Okay, so what that means at its heart is at the heart of civil society, of capitalistic society, are natural resources. Okay, so things like water, things like oil or fossil fuels, things like diamonds, gold, lumber, things like that. In a capitalistic society, we believe in property rights, and this idea that if you own a property, you own most of the natural resources on that property. We have exceptions to this, right? Waterways. Most waterways can't be owned, so that would be a more social control, so socialistic system. But for the most part, in a capitalistic society, there's a individual ownership of natural resources. In a socialistic society, or in socialism, there's all different levels, just like pacifism, but at its heart, it believes that all of the people together should own natural resources, right? And that the way to do that is to make visible and to control the means of production, so that the society as a whole benefits from those natural resources, and then the jobs that are created to use those natural resources and to benefit society need to be evenly distributed. Now, when people think of socialism, they often think of what they're thinking of as communism, which is, the cartoon version is that there's no individual ownership of anything. But at the heart of socialism, that's not the case. It's just believed that natural resources and the means of production should be controlled by the public and not individuals. So just a couple of examples of this are, if you are in the U.S., if you are an oil company, right, all you need to do is gain ownership of land, and then you own the oil there. Of course, it's more complicated than this, but just at the basic level. So you own the oil there. So a company like ExxonMobil can go and buy this patch of land, and then they own that oil and they can go sell it. They might have to pay some fees, but that's it. In a socialistic society, that oil's owned by the public at large. So in most socialistic societies, what happens is, say there is a company like ExxonMobil wants access to the oil on someone's property. What they do is they go to representatives of government, and the representatives say, okay, that oil's owned by the people, but we'll allow you to go in and drill it, but you'll only be able to keep 20% of the profits, or 30% of the profits. The rest of the money goes to the public. And so depending on the society, it's different in each place. But in most of those societies, that money then goes to things like healthcare or education. It's why in a lot of Europe, healthcare is free and education's free or cheap, is because they're more socialistic than we are. Okay, so wells believed in socialism, but he was an extreme socialist. He believed in radical agitation and revolution, that the capitalist system wasn't going to just bend over and cede its power. Instead, you needed to agitate, you needed to revolt, you needed to start a revolution that was going to upend the system. He produced a wide variety of political writings as well as novels and stories. He was often criticized for confusing literature with political pamphleteering. This is why I mentioned earlier that some of his themes in his literature can become heavy-handed and can almost seem like propaganda or pamphleteering. Virginia Woolf famously berated Wells for using the novel for delivering his political ideals. What she means by that is by doing it too obviously, right? When you read Virginia Woolf, she has some radical political ideas that are clear through interpreting her literature that are there, most often about equality of the sexes. But they're not as heavy-handed as H.G. Wells was. He also was obsessed with the idea of utopia. Utopia is a highly regulated world state where all property is owned by the state with equality of the sexes. This is specific to his book, A Modern Utopia. We'll talk about utopia more broadly in a few moments. So in this book, though, there's a hierarchy of classes of the mind ruled in interest by unelected samurai. Now, to understand this and to understand something that we can get out of this text, when we read Allegory of the Cave, we only read part of it. Okay, we read the part that's going to concern us the most, right? I didn't want you to read every part of the Republic or read every part of the Allegory, in that it's not very accessible text, and this isn't a philosophy class, right? So we touch on those ideas, but we're not going to spend class upon class on it. But in his Republic and in further in the Allegory of the Cave, what Plato calls for is exactly what H.G. Wells is calling for here, but instead of unelected samurai, he would call them philosopher kings, people who are further on the path of getting out of the cave and seeing the world as it actually is, should be unelected but have power because of this evolution of their mind. Now, H.G. Wells was so pivotal that his writings have been influenced a lot of other writers, a lot of parts of society in general. Most famously, his writings were the basis of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which a lot of people mark as the moment when we enter the modern era and believe that everybody should have some basic human rights. So his writings were really a basis for that. Let's look into his personal life to understand his psychoanalytic from a psychoanalytic perspective. In 1891, Wells married his cousin, Isabel Mary Wells. The couple agreed to separate in 1894 when he fell in love with one of his students, Amy Catherine Robbins, later known as Jane, who he married in 1895. Okay, so he married his cousin. That sounds strange to us, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but actually cousin marriage throughout history and throughout the world is actually very normal. Americans are the culture that is most offended or viewed as most taboo to marry your cousin. Most societies view it much better light than we do. Matter of fact, over half the world believes in cousin marriage and often prefers cousin marriage because some of the arguments would be you know the person better, your family can vouch for them, and it can keep the wealth within a family if you're a wealthy family. And so my personal theory, this is just my Dory's philosophy, is that I believe because we rebelled against England in the American Revolution, that we rebelled against many English ideas, like social class. Americans like to view ourselves outside of social class, right? Or another is something like cousin marriage. The royal family in England was known for cousin marriage, and so we rebelled against it, and it became a taboo here, right? There's actually, for anything beyond first cousins, there's it's extremely small of any problems in pregnancy or anything like that. It's matter of fact, you're more likely to harm your baby by smoking cigarettes than marrying your second cousin or beyond. So he had 2 sons with Jane, but they had an unusual marriage. Now, we hear a lot of this, and it's going to seem closer to normal in our modern world, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this was radical ideology. He was a radical socialist. He was a person who believed in challenging society in every way you can imagine, revolting, being radical, and challenging every institution. So with his wife's consent, he had many affairs, including some famous ones, famous American birth control activist Margaret Sanger, adventurer and writer Odette Kuhn, novelist Elizabeth von Arnim. He had a daughter with a writer. He had a son with extremely famous writer and feminist Rebecca West. And he wrote in his autobiography, "I was never a great amorist, lover, though I have loved several people very deeply." Okay, so again, just radical, wanted to change the status quo on every level. Just some last notes on his life before we jump into the text. He invented the first recreational war game, Little Wars, very similar to, at a very basic level, like Risk or Axis and Allies, something like that, and was considered the father of this type of wargaming, which later would become things like World of Warcraft, right? And so he's considered the father of that type of gaming. Eventually, later in his life, he lost his faith in humanity, and his later works reflect this and his idea that human society was in a decline. He was hopeless, viewed it as hopeless. He died in 1946 of liver cancer, and so not a very bright end to his life. But he was extremely influential and shaped our society in many ways. So we're going to look into the country of the blind now. We're going to zoom in. I think I want to break this video up, and we're going to that first half will be before you read the text, and then come back after you read the text for the rest of the discussion.